Friends and lovers, welcome to the Jimpressions for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. A visual novel, I suppose, with heavy walking simulator elements. Because you do a lot of walking. Here we are, you traipse as a skeleton across the map of the United States, and there's a ton of storytelling. In fact, the whole game is about storytelling, actually. You wander the United States as a giant skeleton. I don't think that's representative of your actual size, but you're a giant skeleton hiking across the US of A, sometimes getting rides, as we saw there. Although that ride pretty much was the entirety of it. You saw that whole trip. I started the video immediately after I picked up that car and got kicked out, presumably for masturbating in the passenger seat, which wouldn't be the first time that's happened to me. But anyways, here we get to the real meat of the game, which is listening to stories, or rather encountering the stories in-game while you, the player, listen to them. There's a narrator who does most of the heavy lifting when it comes to the vocals, although there are some other voice actors for certain other scenes, which I'm sure we'll see here in the video. But for the most part, it's this this gravelly, gruff American voice. For what is a gravelly, gruff American game, it is deeply American in its storytelling. And when I say that, I'm talking about sort of classic American literature-style stuff. Makes you think of studying Of Mice and Men in school. I don't know if you studied Of Mice and Men in your school. There are many books, and they can't all be studied in school. But they studied Of Mice and Men in my school, so this makes me think of that. And that movie with John Malkovich in it. Not being John Malkovich, which is a really good film, but I mean the movie version of Mice and Men. We studied a lot more British classical literature than American classical literature, because I grew up in Britain, so I was in a British school. So it was a lot more Charles Dickens, and a lot less Mark Twain, who I don't know, it really was just Of Mice and Men, I think, was the only American book of note that we studied. But anyway, you see the influences of that and other books that I've heard of from America in this, and everything about it has that deep-seated classic American feel, right down to the music. Lots of twangy, that's the best way to describe it, isn't it? Twangy music, but beautiful music. Really beautiful soundtrack on this. Very well-written stories. And the only thing that really holds this back is on the technical front. If you like adventure games, if you like visual novels, if you like walking simulators, like the really good ones like Edith Finch, etc., then this is well worth checking out, I think. This is at least worth the time to check out the trial period, give it a go, see how you like it. And if you are a big fan of story-led games in general, there's a good chance you'll consider this one a keeper. And you've got to really like story-driven games. I've got to emphasise that, because that's what this is. It's almost entirely the story. I mean, it's a game about stories as well, so there's a lot of listening, reading, and if that's not your speed, you're gonna really want to look elsewhere. But if it is, then settle down and I'll tell you a little bit more about how the game plays out. So, as you've seen from the video, it's a lot of walking across America, sometimes catching a ride in a car, sometimes stowing on a train, and it getting involved in little stories. Some of them are like pointless little shaggy dog stories, some of them are creepy, some of them are funny, some of them are weird, but they're all important in a way. You travel around the nation collecting these stories, and every now and then you'll come across a campfire and you'll encounter an original character who has their own voice, their own story, and they'll ask you to tell them stories, and you've got to select the sort of stories you think they might be interested in. I mean, I say you've got to, you don't have to. In fact, the game actually tells you at one point that you don't necessarily need to tell them the stories they like. It's not that important that you get them invested in you early on. But we'll talk about investment in a little moment. And look at me, going on like a JRPG. Let me tell you how something works, but first of all, let me just intimate that something else is coming that you've got to worry about, but you might not even get a tutorial about that for like 3 or 4 hours, but just have it in the back of your mind constantly. So we're actually going to look here at a story that I've already listened to and told to someone else at a campfire. So these bits aren't narrated, and they just tell you a little bit of background here about, there's a little kid here at the store telling you about a story. Now, I experienced that earlier on, got a little story about a bottomless lake, or a clear lake. It was both of them, a bottomless and clear lake, and I saw a winged goat, and it was a really cool story, and I immediately retold it the first chance I got, and they didn't really care for the story, but they did at least embellish it and tell it to other people, and that's the point of the game, is to not just have these funny, weird little encounters, but to then regale someone else with the encounter and then see it around the map with people having added details to it. And you can then take that embellished story and tell it again to get it to grow even more. And the whole game is about stories taking on lives of their own. So let's actually show you how you can tell the stories yourself. Here is a campfire, and there's going to be another character at this campfire. I guess we could call them NPCs of a sort. And this is where the payoff for collecting the stories comes in. So you've wandered the States, you've been collecting these little stories, keeping them in your back pocket, and you come across one of these characters who have their own voices, their own unique voice actors, and their own unique stories to tell, but they're not going to give those stories away for nothing. You've got to tell them the kind of stories they like, so they like you more, and will open up more. Now, while the game says that you don't have to ingratiate yourselves to a character immediately, and if you do tell them something that they're not too keen on, it's okay, because they might still tell the story anyway, you nonetheless feel pressured to get them the right stories. So there is still a gamified element to it, despite Where the Water Tastes Like Wine wanting to make that not so apparent. Nonetheless, there are still moments where you might just want to tell a story because you're curious as to how it'll grow. Like the story with the winged goat and the clear bottomless lake. I couldn't tell that one quick enough, regardless of what the person actually wanted. But as you can see, we're talking to this preacher and trying to find exciting stories for him, selecting from these loose tarot card categories. And it's important to note that whether or not a story is exciting or sad is somewhat open to interpretation. There are obvious ones, like the shootout between the bootleggers and the cops. If someone asks for a wild, exciting story, that's a pretty safe one to select. But some of the strange shaggy dog stories that don't seem to go anywhere, they're a bit harder to pinpoint, though you may see other stories around the world in your travels that further contextualise those shaggy dog stories. In any case, this is pretty much the structure of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. Wander the map, collect stories, retell those stories at campfires, and eventually try to get the campfire wanderers to open up about their own lives. After which point, you can of course then tell those stories to people. These stories are said in-game to be the most powerful ones, the ones where people have opened up about their own personal lives. But you can be a naughty, gossipy little skeleton and go and tell other people, can't ya? Also, nobody points out how you're a gigantic skeleton. I think it's like a metaphor and shit, innit? So I said the game's biggest problems were technical. I'll say from a gameplay, from a design standpoint, how slow you trudge and walk across a fairly empty-looking map is a bit annoying as well. But the technical issues are the main bugbears. My experience, at least my personal experience with this, has been a bit stuttery. When you're out on the map, things can chug a fair bit, and it's not a major deal breaker since you are just holding down movement keys and listening to the nice music, but it can still, it's a shame. You know, the game has a nice visual design and wonderful artwork for the stories, but the stories themselves are the other technical slip-up. And when I say technical there, I mean from a writing standpoint, in that there are quite a few typos. There's a lot of text, so you would expect an error here or there, but there are enough for me to make note of it. There are enough that I felt I had to point it out. And for a game that's so story-based, you want to make sure that your story is as polished as it can be. Not just in terms of the tale being told, but the otherwise tantalising text of the tale being told. Sometimes it'll be a very simple typo, sometimes it'll be the wrong spelling of a word with multiple spellings. Sometimes the narrator will use different words from those written on the digital title page, just enough to make the game look more ramshackle than it deserves to look. Which is a shame because this is otherwise an incredibly pleasant game. It's not the most thrilling or enthralling game, but it's incredibly nice. A game that's very easy to just kick back and enjoy without stressing too much about anything. And you don't often get to use the word relaxing when talking about video games, but that's what this is. It's a very relaxing game, very much like sitting down to read a book. A relaxing book, not like Fire and Fury, which you just read while waiting for the bombs to drop. I don't know, like a Richard Bloody Scarry book or something. I know I could have mentioned a great American novel like The Great Gatsby or The Adventures of Huck Finn or something, but I went with Richard Bloody Scarry. And yeah, let's go with that. Here's a quote for your Steam page, mates. Where the water tastes like wine is like reading a Richard Scarry book in the bath. Anyway, crappy book analogies aside, Richard Scarry's Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is an enjoyable, quaint little time. That's fair enough. Yeah, that'll do.